Um, Hello everyone and welcome to the latest Motec webinar. My name's Mark McCoy and I will be your presenter for today. Today's topic is what is CRIP, or crank index position. A fair bit of the information in this webinar will be sort of overlapping with a couple of the other RefSync style webinars that I've done. So as a whole, I would suggest that after you watch this webinar, it'd be a good idea to make sure you've watched the other few RefSync webinars, just so everything ties in nicely. The topics I will be going over today are: what triggers do I have? What is actually on the engine? The ECU reference point, which is an explanation of what the ECU is actually looking for. Calculating CRIP, or calculating crank index position. Checking the crank index position, and just some notes at the end on some special considerations just for various different current style and even much older style crank and cam trigger patterns. What triggers do I have? The first thing you need to have an idea of is what sort of trigger pattern does this engine have. Now down the bottom I've just given a quick three basic crank trigger patterns. So these would be our ref sensor. Now these pretty much cover most of what you'll see today. We've got an even tooth at the left, 12 evenly spaced teeth. We've got a 36 minus 2 in the middle, and on the right we've got an additional tooth mode where it's got 12 teeth plus one of them has been doubled up as a reference point. My webinar today will be based on assuming that we have one single cam tooth or one single sync tooth. I'll mention variations on that at the end. When you're trying to work out what you have on the crank and on the cam, a couple of things that might help you is one, an oscilloscope, a visual inspection actually looking at the trigger disc, and just remember that on some of them, as I've mentioned in previous webinars, the actual output signal from the sensor, which is ultimately what the ECU is reading, may look slightly different to what the actual physical teeth would lead you to believe. So just be a bit careful if you're just counting teeth, especially on some of the newer trigger discs, because they can be a bit deceiving. So realistically, an oscilloscope view, or for those of you used to using Motec software, the RefSync capture in all of our current ECUs is probably the best thing to go by, because like I said, that's what the ECU is ultimately looking at. The crank and cam triggers, the idea behind them is to give the ECU a valid reference point. Now obviously in an engine we've got what we call the cycle, so this is how the induction and the compression and the ignition and expansion and exhaust work. So what we want is we need the ECU to know precisely where the engine is at all given times. So obviously the ECU needs to be able to calculate when and where to fire injectors and ignition. So the idea is through this cam and crank trigger. As a basic explanation, what the ECU will be doing with regards to our crank index position is the ECU is trying to work out one very specific point. Now, what we refer to that as in Motec terminology is our index tooth. So this whole trigger pattern, what we're actually trying to do is find one specific tooth and calling it the index tooth. It sort of leads on to crank index position. Taking a fairly classic missing tooth mode, you can see down the bottom we've got our ref signal on the top and our sync signal down the bottom. Again, like I said, a single sync pulse. What we're trying to do is we use the sync sensor to choose a index tooth. Now, as you can see here, obviously in a 4-stroke engine, as the crank goes around in one cycle, we will see these missing teeth twice. What we use the sync signal for is to just simply pick the missing teeth that happen after the sync signal. Now, from left to right, we're talking about the direction of the engine actually moving in its normal running mode. So we can see that the first set of missing teeth, where I've got ignore these missing teeth, the ECU is not worried about them because the sync tooth hasn't happened yet. And you can see that I've circled my sync tooth and pointing to what we've now termed the index tooth. That is the index position that comes after the sync signal. Now this does actually depend on what type of mode we're using. So I've just given you a couple of other examples there. With our even tooth mode up the top there, we can see that the index tooth is the ref tooth that happens directly after the sync tooth. And on our additional tooth mode down the bottom, that was our 12+1, we actually use not so much the additional tooth, but the very next one after that. So in these three examples, you can see which tooth is actually chosen as the index tooth depending on the trigger pattern on the crank. Again, that's why it's so important to know exactly what the tooth pattern is on the crank as well as the cam. Now, this index tooth, here's how we lead on to our crank index position. The crank index position is how many crank degrees is the index tooth before top dead center compression number 1 cylinder. Okay, TDC compression number 1 is what we at Motec try to refer the entire engine to. So once the ECU knows exactly where TDC compression number 1 cylinder is, and it knows, say, that the engine's a 4-cylinder, it can then calculate, okay, well, where is TDC compression number 2, 3, and 4, and so on. As a run through of how to calculate this CRIP if you wanted to do it on an engine. Now I've used a missing tooth mode here, more specifically this is 24-2 like you might find on some of the newer bikes. What you want to do is wind the engine over, always in the running direction. We don't want to turn this backwards at all until the sync tooth lines up with the sync sensor. So that's obviously when the sync signal will occur. I've got those both circled in blue there so you can see on my little diagram up the top, and also the actual output of the sensors. So not too worried about the ref at the moment. So we find the sync tooth, and now knowing that it's a missing tooth mode, we need to find where is the index tooth based on the missing tooth mode pattern. So if I go to the next slide, we can see here that that index tooth is located there. See, the very next time we see the missing teeth after the sync tooth. So we've wound the engine forward, say, another half, 3/4 of a turn. So at this point in time, we now need to understand that that index tooth, or that position of the crank with the ref sensor lined up with that index tooth, we need to take note of how far do we have to turn this crank in cranking degrees from this point back to top dead center compression number 1. And on my next slide we can sort of see that it's about 8 teeth there. So you need to know exactly what number of degrees that is. Now, you don't have to be super accurate at this point in time, but you have to be, within 10 or 15 degrees either way, because we're just doing this by eye at the moment, and what we're going to do further on is we're actually going to check this number with a timing light to make sure it's correct. So, like I said, no need to be super accurate at this particular point in time. So, from the previous diagram, I've worked out that it's about 150 degrees from my index tooth to top dead center compression number 1. Again, always turning the engine in the running direction. So I simply enter that number. Crank index position is in degrees. It's not a weird calculated computer type number. It's actual crank degrees. So I simply enter 150 in my crank index position. And just in blue there, I've sort of given you a list of the menus that you go through to get to this setup page. Again, if you go to my previous RefSync webinars, you'll be able to get a bit more detail on this. Now, here's back to my couple of examples on the even tooth mode and the additional tooth mode. So you can sort of see how the CRIP differs based on basically having the sync position in the same position, but because my ref or my crank trigger pattern is different, it sort of modifies which tooth we're actually choosing as the index tooth. Checking CRIP. Luckily in all of our ECU software we have a nice convenient page which is called the Test Advanced screen. Now you can see in my little menu item at the side there the crank index position. Oh, actually got a different number in there, so I apologize for that. But effectively that's the same crank index position we have put in the previous screen. We have in that screen also what's called the Test Advance. Now the Test Advance is quite important. Now, if I'll just go to the next screen. So what we need to do is set the Test Advance to, in this case, 0. So effectively what that is in this screen we have locked all the ignition timing calculations to 0 degrees. So based on our crank index position, the ECU is going to try to give us what it reckons 0 degrees ignition timing is. Completely locked. We're not using the main ignition table. We're not using any compensations. Just this simple one Test Advance value. So if we wind the engine over and use the timing light, we should hopefully get 0 degrees on the timing light as well. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to basically say, based on our crank index position and our locked Test Advance of 0, the timing light should say 0. Now, if the timing light says maybe 5 degrees advanced, that means our CRIP is wrong by 5 degrees and it needs to be increased by 5. So again, like I said, this is crank index position is in raw degrees. So whatever your timing light's out by, that's how much your CRIP is out by. So leaving the Test Advance at 0, you would adjust your crank index position by 5, check it again. Timing light says 0 now, that matches our Test Advance, that means our CRIP is now correct. So even if you set a Test Advance of 10, timing light should show 10. Once you go back out of this screen, the ECU reverts to using the main ignition table and all the compensations. Just a couple of considerations to be aware of. There are obviously many different crank and cam style triggers out there. For things like group fire engines, which would probably be a fairly old school engine where they might have just had a crank trigger and no sync. Classically, I've listed 3 basic sort of scenarios. One where we have maybe one tooth for every firing. So like early engines, 4-cylinder may have only had 2 teeth on the crank. Your CRIP is simply how far is that one of those teeth before a top dead center. These engines will all have a distributor, so and the injectors will fire together, so it's a very simple pattern. With a missing tooth mode with no sync, the CRIP would be, and this is my little example in the diagram below, the CRIP is simply from the missing teeth to top dead center number 1, exhaust or compression. We haven't got a sync sensor, so we can't really tell. These engines will have either wasted spark or a distributor for ignition, and all the injectors will pretty much fire at once. The additional tooth mode with no sync is quite similar. It's just the index tooth back to top dead center, exhaust or compression. Again, no sync sensor. We haven't got a really good way of working out where the engine is specifically. So these are group fired engines. For what we call OEM modes, things are a little bit different, and this is where you might need a bit more help from the Motec staff. But what we consider OEM modes are modes where the crank and cam trigger patterns don't really follow any conventional rules. This is especially true of variable cam engines, where the sync or cam teeth need to do two jobs. One, give the ECU a cycle position, and two, they need to actually give you a cam advance or retard position as well. My diagram there shows that I have it's a 60 minus 2 on the crank, but it has 4 unevenly spaced sync teeth. So what the ECU would do, it would decode that back down to a single point. I've marked that with the arrow there, and then from there it becomes a simple missing tooth mode and follows all the rules that we've just been through. Again, like I said, a ref sync capture emailed to the guys at Motec, myself or anyone else, and we will be able to give you a bit more advice. And for most OEM modes, luckily we have all this information. We can send it directly to you. Thank you for attending this webinar. I hope it's been informative. For those people that aren't familiar with our webinars, I'd just like to let them know that all of these are recorded live. So simply go to motec.com.au for our webinars page, and you'll be able to get more or less the back catalogue of all the ones we've done in the past. Another good suggestion is to join our web forum, so that if it's late at night, maybe us guys here in Australia have gone home for the night, if you get on the forum, just like any other forum, you can ask your questions there. There's very knowledgeable people all there to help. So thank you for joining, and I hope you can attend our later webinars.